Market towns, like people, often sleep with one eye open, not from fear, but habit. Flaxborough had always preferred to notice its own business just long enough to report it later, which is perhaps why, at 12 minutes past midnight, no one but Mr. Ernest Lum, milkman by profession and philosopher by inclination, saw the man standing quite still beneath the gas lamp in the square, smiling faintly at something invisible. Lum, who prided himself on his powers of observation, was delivering early to the postmaster's house and would later recall the scene in a manner both precise and impossible. "He were looking up," he said, "only there weren't nothing there, just grinning at the air like he'd remembered a joke halfway through it." At the time, however, Lum merely paused long enough to wonder whether the man might be drunk, or worse, a poet. Finding neither prospect attractive, he resumed his round. By dawn, Flaxborough's usual peace had been restored, its pavements scrubbed by dew, its public clock obstinately 5 minutes slow. The first disruption of the day came at precisely 7:45, when Mrs. Good, on her way to open the bakery, noticed a figure seated upright on the bench beneath the same gas lamp. He was, as she put it, unnaturally tidy. His hat rested squarely on his knees. His lips were parted in that same faint smile. His skin, however, had acquired a waxy stillness that discouraged conversation. The police was summoned with commendable efficiency, though it took another 15 minutes for anyone to recall that the station telephone had been out of order for 2 days. A constable was therefore dispatched at a brisk walk, during which time a small crowd formed. Mrs. Good, the butcher, the verger, and a boy with a bicycle who had very little to contribute but much to enjoy. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, hat square, gaze mild, coat neatly buttoned, the corpse had been properly admired by most of the neighbourhood. Purbright took off his gloves and regarded the scene with the faintly benign interest of a man inspecting a shop window. "Unusual expression," he remarked, more to himself than to the constable. "People rarely meet their end with satisfaction." The constable, eager to be helpful, said, "Perhaps he died happy." "Sir?" Purbright's smile was as faint as the dead man's. "If so, we may hope it wasn't contagious." He stooped, inspected the man's hands, gloved, spotless, and noted the shoes, polished recently and with some care. He touched the brim of the dead man's hat, then replaced it gently. "No struggle," he murmured, "and no sign of haste. He seems to have come here deliberately." A few townsfolk lingered on the edge of curiosity. Mrs. Good, practical and never shy of stating what others only hinted, said, "He's not one of ours, Inspector. I'd have seen him in the shop." "Then perhaps he's only passing through," Purbright replied mildly, though one might wish he'd chosen a more comfortable resting place. By 9 o'clock, the body had been conveyed to the mortuary, leaving behind only the lingering impression of that strange, quiet smile, the kind that seemed to mock both the living and the dead for making such a fuss. That afternoon, as the gossip began its slow, satisfying fermentation, Purbright sat in his office at the station. His Sergeant Love entered with a file of preliminary notes. "Name's not known yet, sir." "No papers on him. Pockets clean as a Sunday tablecloth. Not even a bus ticket." "Not a one. Wallet empty, too." Purbright considered this. "Then either robbery or preparation for it. The distinction is largely academic until we know what he had to lose." Sergeant Love nodded, uncertain whether philosophy was required. "Odd thing, sir, but doctor says he's been dead about 6 hours. Heart stopped neat as you like." "No bruises, no marks?" Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed. "A heart that stops neatly," he said softly, "is usually persuaded to do so." He looked again at the photograph on the desk, the man on the bench, smiling faintly at nothing, as though he'd just heard the ending of a joke that no one else understood. "Have the chemist's wife come in," he said at last. "She's the sort who notices people's prescriptions and their peculiar habits." The sergeant paused. You think she knew him? I think, said Purbright, that everyone in Flaxborough knows something about someone they shouldn't. Outside, the church clock began its slow chime toward noon. The sound drifted through the open window, calm and unhurried, as though time itself in Flaxborough preferred to take its clues one at a time. By the time the church clock struck 10, the dead man in the square had lived again in a dozen conversations, each version more detailed, more tragic, and considerably more entertaining than the last. Mrs. Good, who had discovered the body, told everyone at the bakery that she had looked straight into his eyes, poor soul, and seen the peace of heaven upon him. This claim was slightly undermined by her later remark that there was something smug about him, too, like he'd won something. Meanwhile, Mr. Lum the milkman, elevated to witness status, had developed his account to heroic proportions. By 11 he was saying that he had nearly approached the smiling man to offer assistance, thinking the chap might be having a seizure of religious ecstasy or a funny turn. By lunchtime, it had become a story of moral courage. He had refrained, he now said, so as not to startle the fellow if he were meditating. The verger, who had known neither man nor milk, told the postmistress that he had heard a strange humming noise just before midnight, which he now described as like bees in a bottle. The postmistress, who prided herself on literacy, passed it on to a customer as chanting. By tea-time, the entire west side of Flaxborough was convinced there had been a midnight ritual. Across the high street, Mrs. Biggs at the hairdresser's declared with authority that the deceased had visited her shop the previous Thursday for a trim and tonic. Her assistant quietly pointed out that the dead man had not, in fact, had much hair. Mrs. Biggs replied, then he must have been thinking of coming, which, in Flaxborough logic, counted as fact, Inspector Purbright, being aware that the truth often arrived late to such gatherings, went about his work with deliberate slowness. The corpse had yielded nothing, no identification, no obvious cause of death, and not so much as a laundry mark to help along the investigation. The pathologist's report, when it came, was brief. Heart failure of uncertain origin. Unusual muscular tension in the facial region. Sergeant Love, reading this aloud, frowned, meaning he smiled himself to death. Purbright looked up from his papers, a trace of humour behind his eyes. We shall withhold that conclusion until we've exhausted the alternatives. That afternoon, Purbright visited Mrs. Winstanley, wife of the town's chemist, who had been aware of the deceased as a lodger above her shop. Her drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender polish and moral superiority. Yes, Inspector, she said, settling her hands on her knees. Mr. Hartley, that was his name, took the upper room 3 weeks ago. Very quiet, always polite. Paid in advance, which one appreciates, though. She lowered her voice as though sharing a scandal. There were occasions when he came in quite late. Past 11? Unusual hours for Flaxborough, Purbright agreed. Precisely. And he would bring with him visitors. The word conveyed sin, sedition, and something faintly continental. Men, sometimes women. Always stayed briefly. Once I heard laughter, quite sudden. Then silence. Did he drink? Tea, Inspector. And occasionally, I fear, something stronger. I saw a bottle once, foreign label. And the cork? Oh dear, loose. Purbright inclined his head gravely, as if a loose cork were the surest sign of moral decay. And did any of these visitors return after his death? Mrs. Winstanley stiffened. Certainly not. We do not encourage that sort of haunting. He thanked her for her help and left her to spread the story that she had assisted police inquiries which would keep her quite occupied for the rest of the week. That evening, as the lamps along the high street glowed to life, the town's gossip matured like cheese. At the King's Head, the publican confided to his regulars that the dead fellow was one of them spiritualists. You can tell by the grin. At the post office, The clerks wondered whether he might have been poisoned by some foreign woman. And at the council offices, Alderman Chubb, large, pink, and self-satisfied, told anyone who would listen that it was a clear case of heart attack. The poor chap had no business for public alarm. "Still," murmured Councillor Bassett, odd to die smiling. "Better than dying scowling," Chubb replied, which was taken as wisdom. What none of them mentioned, though several privately thought, was that Mr. Hartley's death might complicate certain pending matters at the council. A small parcel of riverside property had been under negotiation, one that Mr. Hartley, according to rumour, had shown inconvenient interest in acquiring. At the station, Purbright made notes with the unhurried neatness of a man adding columns for patience and irony. Sergeant Love hovered nearby, uncertain whether to offer tea or insight. "No signs of struggle, sir?" Love said again, as if repetition might conjure progress. Just that smile. "Yes," Purbright said softly. "A man who smiles at nothing usually knows something unpleasant that others don't." Love frowned. "Do you think he was poisoned?" Purbright's pencil paused. Perhaps he was frightened into forgetting he was afraid." The sergeant blinked. "That doesn't make much sense, sir." "Most human behaviour doesn't," said Purbright mildly, "which is why it's such an effective disguise." He closed the file, stood, and walked to the window. Outside the street was quiet, the lamplight steady. Somewhere a cat yowled, possibly in protest against the town's moral tone. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll speak to the milkman again. I'd like him to show me exactly where the man was standing when he smiled." Sometimes geography has more to say than witnesses. Love nodded, though uncertain why. Purbright looked out across the sleeping town, where curiosity flickered in every curtained window. "It seems," he said, "that Flaxborough is about to discover the rarest of all crimes." "What's that, sir?" "One that makes everyone else feel a little guilty." The next morning dawned bright and too cheerful for Flaxborough's taste. Sunshine had a way of making its inhabitants uneasy. It showed up the dust on the curtains and the cracks in their alibis. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love stood outside Winstanley's chemist, where the late Mr. Colin Hartley had rented his room. The chemist himself, a pale, twitchy man who regarded conversation as a medical risk, greeted them at the door. "Upstairs, gentlemen. Though I'll warn you, my wife's tidied. There's not much left to see." "That," said Purbright with quiet humour, "is usually the first crime scene improvement." They climbed the narrow stairs, which smelled faintly of camphor and disinfectant. The room was modest but orderly. A small table, a chair, a bed that looked scarcely used. A row of neatly aligned books stood on the windowsill, their titles hinting at a man more philosophical than practical. The Psychology of Persuasion, a treatise on tranquility, and, curiously, the Law of Property Transactions. Purbright ran a finger along the spines. "A man who likes to keep both mind and paperwork in order." Love, examining the drawers, reported, "Clothes, sir, pressed, labels cut out." "Ah," murmured Purbright. A tidy mind, but a cautious one. The sergeant looked up. "You think he was hiding something?" Purbright's smile was faint. "I think he was making himself harder to describe." He turned his attention to the writing desk, empty, save for a small inkwell, 2 unused envelopes, and a folded newspaper clipping. The article, dated 3 weeks prior, reported on the council's plans to redevelop the old river, warehouses into luxury flats, befitting Flaxborough's modern ambitions. Tuttia, red pencil circle marked the name Alderman Chubb. Purbright tucked the clipping into his notebook. "Our late Mr. Hartley, it seems, was interested in civic progress." Downstairs, Mrs. Winstanley intercepted them with the bright anxiety of someone desperate not to be excluded from officialdom. "You found something, Inspector?" "Possibly," said Purbright gently. "Did Mr. Hartley receive any correspondence?" "Only a few envelopes, all with London postmarks. Plain. I didn't pry. Of course." She hesitated, then added with the air of righteousness, though once I did happen to notice one was sealed in black wax.
Very old-fashioned. And a woman's hand, indeed,
said Purbright, his tone a shade drier than usual. Black wax.
How uncommonly stylish. I thought it odd, she said quickly.
Almost romantic, side, if one can use such a word about business. One can, said Purbright, if one wishes to start half the gossip in town, back at the station. Purbright and Love examined what little evidence they had. The dead man's effects, keys, handkerchief, 2 coins, no wallet, were arranged neatly in a tray. The constable on duty had added a note. Subject's shoes polished recently, soles damp, as if from Riverside Path. Purbright looked at it thoughtfully. He smiled beneath the clock tower, but came from the river. Interesting route. Maybe he took the long way round, sir, Love offered. People only take the long way when they're delaying something unpleasant, Purbright said softly. He leaned back. Sergeant, make some inquiries at the land registry. See whether Mr. Hartley made any purchase or application relating to the riverfront. And ask whether Alderman Chubb's signature appears anywhere it shouldn't. Love hesitated.
You think there's council business involved?
I think, said Purbright, that death in Flaxborough is rarely personal. It's usually administrative. Later that afternoon, Purbright paid a courtesy call to Alderman Chubb's office, a place of plush furniture, stale cigar smoke, and self-importance. Chubb himself, wide-faced and gleaming, received the inspector with what he considered charm. Terrible business, Purbright. Terrible. Poor chap. Always sad when someone drops dead in public. Unsettling for the ratepayers. Purbright nodded politely. You knew him then? Met him once, said Chubb too quickly. Came to a council meeting, introduced himself as an investor. Seemed to know a fair bit about property.
Too much, really. Always a sign of trouble, eh?
I wouldn't know, Purbright replied mildly. Most trouble in my experience begins with people knowing too little. Chubb chuckled uncertainly, tugging at his collar. Well, no harm done.
Heart attack, wasn't it?
Doctor hasn't said. That silence lingered just long enough for Chubb to fill it with nervous words. I mean, that's the sensible conclusion, isn't it? Can't have been anything else. Indeed, said Purbright.
And yet he was smiling, Chubb blinked.
Smiling? Broadly.
At midnight, alone. Oh. The alderman shifted in his chair.
Strange habits, these city types.
Always smiling or meditating or something.
Couldn't tell you why, Purbright inclined his head. No, I imagine not. On his walk back to the station, Purbright passed the square where it had all begun. The bench had been scrubbed, the gas lamp extinguished, but the sense of something unresolved hung in the air like the scent of old rain. A woman sweeping her shop doorway paused to nod politely. Flaxborough, ever adaptable, was already folding the mystery into its routines. A newspaper boy passed him, shouting, "Death in Market Square!"
Police baffled.
Purbright smiled faintly. We mustn't disappoint, he murmured. That evening, he dined quietly in his rooms, reading through the coroner's notes once more. Toxicology pending. Nothing obvious. The dead man's grin, the physician had noted, might have been the result of neurological spasm, emotional reaction, or chemical influence. Purbright wrote 3 words in his notebook. Chemical, emotional, both. He lit his pipe, leaned back, and looked out through the window at the faint glow of the town beyond. Somewhere, a church bell tolled 9. Slow, deliberate, reflective, Mr. Hartley, he said softly. I should like to know what you found so amusing. Flaxborough Town Council met, as it often did, not to decide anything but to appear in the act of doing so. Its members, each possessed of a strong sense of importance and a weak grasp of irony, had assembled that Monday evening in the municipal chamber, which smelled faintly of ink, damp carpet, and civic pride. At the head of the long table sat Alderman Chubb, his complexion suggesting prosperity and mild indigestion. He rapped the gavel with a flourish that seemed to surprise even himself. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, before we proceed to the matter of sewerage expenditure, it is proper that we acknowledge with sorrow, the unfortunate demise of Mr. Colin Hartley, a recent resident of our borough. There was a solemn murmur. Councillor Bassett, who enjoyed any excuse for public gravity, lowered his head and murmured something that might have been, "Here, here." Councillor Rudd, less sentimental, took the opportunity to pour himself water. Chubb continued, "Mr. Hartley, I am informed, was a man of means and refinement. His sudden passing is, therefore, not merely tragic, but unfortunate in timing. He had, I believe, expressed an interest in the council's redevelopment of the riverfront properties." A discreet rustle passed down the table, the sound of people pretending they had not already discussed it over. Lunch? Councillor Bassett, ever eager to appear useful, said, "Does this, in practical terms, delay the project?" Chubb smiled, but it was the smile of a man who suspected the room was full of mirrors.
No, purely administrative.
Title deeds, of course, revert to public record. We shall continue our efforts to ensure those old warehouses are put to good, profitable use." "Public use," corrected Councillor Rudd mildly. Yes, said Chubb, his hand fluttering like a nervous bird. "Of course, public use, naturally." Outside, the meeting's solemnity was already dissolving into gossip. Councillor Mrs. Shale confided to the borough librarian that poor Mr. Hartley's heart must have given out from disappointment after dealing with Chubb, who wouldn't die smiling. The librarian, who collected scandal the way others collected stamps, nodded gravely and made a mental note to repeat the line later at the Women's Institute. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, sat quietly in the back row of the chamber, pretending to read the agenda while actually studying faces. Chubb, he noticed, avoided eye contact with Councillor Rudd, but exchanged a brief, significant glance with a clerk near the doorway, a young man whose nervousness could have powered a small windmill. After the meeting adjourned, Purbright approached him. "Mr. Latham, isn't it?" The clerk started as though caught with his hand in the till. "Yes, Inspector. Nothing wrong, I hope?" "On the contrary. I was merely admiring your efficiency. You seemed very alert during the alderman's remarks." Latham blushed. "Oh, yes, sir. Just taking notes. Diligent of you. Tell me, did Mr. Hartley ever contact the council directly?"
Latham hesitated.
"Once or twice, I think. Letters about the property."
"I only handled the drafts. May I see them?"
"They were returned to him, sir."
"As per policy."
Purbright smiled gently. "Quite so. Policies are often inconveniently precise." He let the silence grow until the clerk's discomfort began to leak into confession. "He did come in once," Latham said finally, "to deliver a form in person. Wanted confirmation that his purchase of warehouse number 4 was properly recorded. Seemed anxious. I mentioned the paperwork was still being processed. Was Alderman Chubb present at the time?" "Yes, sir." "In his office?" "He called me in to say the matter was sensitive and should be delayed pending further discussion." Purbright nodded. "And did Mr. Hartley know of that delay?" Latham swallowed. "He did after that, sir. He wasn't happy. Said he'd speak to someone in London about it." "London?" Purbright repeated softly. "Did he specify who?" "No, sir. Just someone who'd be interested to learn how Flaxborough conducts business." Purbright's eyebrows rose, though his tone remained conversational. How civic-minded of him. Later that night in his office, Purbright summarized the day's findings in his usual tidy handwriting. Observation: Chubb overacts sympathy. Latham anxious. Hartley's interest: property near river, warehouse number 4, black wax letter from London. Possible connection: female hand. Motive emerging: obstruction of transaction. He leaned back, lit his pipe, and watched the smoke drift like lazy thought. Sergeant Love, entering with 2 cups of tea, asked, "Council give you anything useful, sir?" "Only evidence of their continued existence," said Purbright dryly. Though Alderman Chubb seems determined to prove that bureaucracy can be both profitable and terminal, Love frowned. "Meaning, sir?" "Meaning," said Purbright, "our late Mr. Hartley may have been smiling not at heaven, but at the thought of catching someone out." He sipped his tea thoughtfully.
"Tell me, Sergeant, When an honest man finds himself in a dishonest town, what happens?
Love, who had once failed an exam in moral philosophy, ventured, "He either leaves or starts smiling, sir." "Exactly," said Purbright. "And sometimes he's helped to stop smiling altogether." The next morning's newspaper reported that the council had unanimously expressed condolences and would ensure the river redevelopment proceeds without delay. The article's final line, Inspector Purbright declined to comment, was perhaps the most accurate. At the police station, the Morning Post brought one letter of mild interest. It was forwarded from Hartley's London lodging, sealed in black wax, addressed in a careful female hand. The return address read simply, "Miss A. Greening, Temple Gardens, London." Purbright examined it for a long moment before opening. Inside was a brief note. "Dear Mr. Hartley, please confirm that the transfer documents were duly signed. I am told there are local obstacles. Do not trust the council's assurances. I can be in Flaxborough by Thursday." A.G. He looked up at Sergeant Love. "It seems," he said quietly, "that Thursday will bring us a woman who dislikes obstacles." "Friend of the deceased?"
asked Love. "Possibly," said Purbright.
"Or someone with a better reason than friendship to smile at midnight?" The following morning found Inspector Purbright standing once again in Flaxborough's Market Square, hands in his coat pockets, hat tilted against the early drizzle. He had arranged to meet Ernest Lum, milkman, part-time philosopher, and full-time conversationalist, at the very bench where Colin Hartley had ended his brief, smiling life. Lum arrived leading his rattling milk cart, cheerful in the way that only men with gossip to sell can be. "Morning, Inspector. You'll be wanting to hear it again, I reckon." Purbright nodded mildly. "If you'd be so good as to demonstrate, Mr. Lum. Begin, perhaps, where you first saw the gentleman." The milkman squinted up at the gas lamp above the bench.
Right there he was.
"Just after midnight, I'd say. Standing like a post, staring at the clock tower. I says to myself, either he's counting minutes or he's lost one." Purbright's gaze followed the line of Lum's pointing hand, from the gas lamp to the tower opposite, then downward toward the narrow lane that led to the river. "You're certain he faced the clock?" "Certain as I am of me own boots, sir." "Strange," murmured Purbright. "Because if he were looking at the clock, the light from the lamp would have been directly behind him."
One could hardly see his expression, Lum frowned, thinking. I suppose not, though I could have sworn he was smiling." "Perhaps," Purbright said gently.
"It was the light you saw smiling, not the man." The milkman scratched his chin, unwilling to be robbed of his witness importance. "Well, maybe, but he were calm, not fidgety, like he were waiting for someone." "Waiting," repeated Purbright softly. "Did you see anyone else?" "No one." "Quiet as a pew." He hesitated. "Though now you mention it, I did hear something odd a minute later.
Sort of a cough from down that lane by the river."
Thought it was just the fog catching in me throat at the time." Purbright's eyes narrowed.
"A cough, you say? One or several?"
"Just one, sir. Short and sharp, like someone was hiding and didn't quite manage it." The inspector smiled faintly, not from amusement, but the satisfaction of a puzzle piece turning slightly in his mind. "Mr. Lum," he said, "you have done the rarest thing in Flaxborough, noticed something true without improving upon it."
"My congratulations." Lum grinned, uncertain whether he had been complimented or classified.
"Happy to help, sir. Always had an eye for peculiarities." "Yes," said Purbright, "and you'll do well to keep it. Most people here prefer not to look at all." By midday, Purbright and Sergeant Love were walking the riverside path behind the warehouses. Rain had made the cobbles slick, and the air smelled of mud, rope, and the faint melancholy that always hangs about disused property. Purbright paused near warehouse number 4, the one circled in Hartley's newspaper clipping. A faint smear of white paint marked the doorframe, as though someone had recently sanded off a number. "Sergeant," Purbright said, "what does our registry say about ownership here?" Love consulted his notebook. "Still under provisional transfer, sir. The old title expired but the new one not completed. Seems our Mr. Hartley was buying from a shell company linked to the council. Purbright's eyes flickered.
And who, I wonder, owns the shell? Love frowned.
No name given, just initials. A.G. and Co. Purbright's face remained impassive, though his tone sharpened slightly. A.G. as in Miss A. Greening, perhaps? Love blinked. The woman who wrote that letter? Same, said Purbright. It appears the late Mr. Hartley was not only negotiating with the council, he was caught between two proprietors, one of them impatient. He knelt to inspect the cobblestones. There, half hidden in a puddle, lay a small metal token, a cufflink, engraved with the letter C. Purbright pocketed it carefully. Find out, he said, whether Alderman Chubb ever lost his temper, and if so, whether he also lost a cufflink. That afternoon, as the rain cleared, Flaxborough resumed its habitual rhythm of curiosity disguised as civility. The town barber told his clients that Inspector Purbright's on to something big, seen him near the river with a magnifying glass. The vicar's wife speculated that the deceased might have been a spy, while Mrs. Winstanley confided to her neighbour that the police had discovered foreign mud on the man's shoes. By tea-time, Hartley's death had been promoted from curiosity to parable. The town, in its usual democratic manner, agreed that whatever had happened, he had probably brought it on himself. Purbright returned to his office and sat gazing at the photograph again. The man on the bench, serene the faint upward curve of the mouth. "Love," he said suddenly, "tell me, what does one do when one realizes he's been deceived?" Love looked uncertain. "Depends who's done the deceiving, sir." "Indeed. But suppose the deceiver were a partner."
Someone he trusted, then I'd say he'd want to make it known.
Or, said Purbright quietly, he might simply smile. Love gave him a wary glance. Like Mr. Hartley. Precisely. Purbright reached for the phone. "Get me a message sent to the railway office. Miss A. Greening arrives from London Thursday morning. Have her shown directly here. Do you think she's mixed up in it?" Purbright gave a small shrug. "Mixed up, yes. In what capacity remains to be seen. But it's the sort of mixture that tends to curdle quickly when exposed to daylight." At 7 that evening, the station door creaked open. Constable Harrow entered, clutching a damp envelope. "Message from the post," he said. "Addressed to the deceased, found undelivered. Thought you'd want it, sir." Purbright took it, slit the flap neatly, and drew out a single sheet. "Colin, you must stop this at once. He knows you've discovered the sale. If you go public, you'll be made to look the villain. Wait until I arrive. Midnight Thursday. Burn this, no signature. Only a faint scent of lavender soap and the impression of careful handwriting under pressure. The kind that comes from panic, restrained by dignity." Purbright read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. "Midnight Thursday," he repeated quietly. "The man who smiled at midnight. Perhaps he wasn't smiling at something, Sergeant. Perhaps he was smiling for someone, and she never came." Love swallowed.
"You think Miss Greening?"
"Possibly," said Purbright, slipping the letter into his pocket. Or possibly she wasn't the one he expected to meet at all. He extinguished his lamp, the smoke from his pipe curling up like the thought of something not yet understood. "Flaxborough," he murmured, "has begun to yawn, which means it's about to wake up." Miss Ada Greening arrived in Flaxborough precisely at 10:45 Thursday morning, dressed in the tidy neutrality of a woman who travelled often and trusted no timetable. She was tall, self-contained, her clothes severe but impeccably chosen, the kind of wardrobe that announced discretion without advertising cost. Inspector Purbright met her at the station himself, a courtesy she noted but did not mistake for gallantry.
"Inspector Purbright," she said, extending a hand.
"You received my letter?" "I did," he replied mildly. "I fear Mr. Hartley no longer can." A faint tightening around her mouth betrayed that she had known, but had not yet accepted.
"So it's true then," she said quietly. "Colin's dead. Quite true, I'm afraid."
Though not quite understood, he gestured toward his car. If you'll allow me, we might discuss the matter at the station. More privacy there than the local cafe, unless you'd prefer the gossip to warm before it spreads. Her faint smile was not unappreciative. Lead the way, Inspector. At the station, Miss Greening took the offered chair opposite Purbright's desk and folded her gloved hands neatly in her lap. I expected, she began, to be speaking to Mr. Hartley, not about him. We had business together regarding the warehouse properties on the river? Her eyes flickered. You're well informed. Not well enough, Purbright said gently. I know he was purchasing number 4 on behalf of your firm, AG & Co. I also know the council delayed his application, and that he may have expressed discontent rather too openly for local taste. Miss Greening removed her gloves with deliberate precision. Inspector, I don't imagine you'd be shocked to hear that Flaxborough's council enjoys a rather creative relationship with property. Hartley discovered that Alderman Chubb and his associates had registered dummy buyers, all front companies, to acquire council-owned land at undervalued rates. He intended to expose it. Expose it to whom? To the ministry. We had evidence. He only needed the final deed from the local registry to prove Chubb's signature was forged. Purbright's gaze remained calm, almost sympathetic.
And did he obtain that deed?
He was due to collect it the night he died. There was a brief, brittle silence. Purbright tapped his pencil thoughtfully. You refer, I suppose, to Wednesday night, the same evening he was seen smiling at midnight. Yes, she said. He was meant to meet someone by the river to exchange the document. He told me he'd arranged a quiet handover. That's why I wrote to warn him. Chubb had found out. Purbright leaned back. You knew Chubb personally?
I've met the type, she said dryly.
The species is common to every borough, plump, confident, and allergic to sunlight. Purbright almost smiled.
I take it your letter arrived too late. Her eyes softened slightly, though her voice remained controlled.
I wish it hadn't. Colin could be impulsive when his conscience caught fire. He believed justice was its own insurance policy. An admirable belief, Purbright said, though rarely honoured by underwriters. When Miss Greening had gone, leaving behind a faint scent of bergamot and irritation, Purbright remained seated, fingers steepled. Sergeant Love entered, file in hand. Message from the registry, sir. They've found the deed transfer. Mr. Hartley filed. It's genuine enough, except there's no council seal on it. No seal. No, sir. Just a signature, Alderman Chubb's, and one witness, C. Winstanley. That'd be the chemist, wouldn't it? Purbright's expression did not change, but the corners of his eyes tightened.
The chemist, he murmured.
A useful man for quiet paperwork.
And his wife did say she noticed late-night visitors. Love blinked. You think they were part of it? I think they were part of something.
Whether they knew what they were part of is another matter entirely. He rose, reached for his hat. Come, Sergeant. Let's pay our pharmacist a call. I'm developing a small headache of curiosity. The Winstanley's chemist shop smelled of eucalyptus and middle class. Rectitude. Mr. Winstanley appeared behind the counter like a ghost reluctantly recalled by...
Incantation, Inspector, he said, wringing his hands. Again?
Only a small matter, said Purbright pleasantly.
A legal signature went on a property deed. Yours, apparently. The man's complexion drained like tonic water in a sink. Oh, that.
Yes, well, Alderman Chubb asked me to witness it.
Quite routine, you understand.
He said it was merely a council formality. Did Mr. Hartley sign in your presence? No, the papers were already complete.
I was told it was just a clerical confirmation. Purbright's tone remained mild.
So you signed a document attesting to something you didn't witness? Well, yes, but I've done that before, he said, then immediately looked horrified by the admission.
I mean, as a matter of convenience. Convenience, said Purbright softly, is often the mother of misconduct. Mrs. Winstanley appeared from the back room, cheeks flushed. Inspector, I must object.
My husband has always acted from civic duty.
I'm sure he has, said Purbright.
It's the sort of civic duty that often requires discreet ink. When they left, Love muttered, They look frightened. They look guilty, Purbright corrected mildly. Fear only comes later, when guilt grows teeth. He paused under the awning, watching a cart splash past through the drizzle. You see, Sergeant, Chubb's kind never handles poison directly. They outsource it to respectability. A chemist, for instance, Love frowned.
You think Hartley was poisoned?
Purbright's gaze returned to the square.
His face suggests it. Paralysis of the smile.
But poison wasn't the point. It's what he was holding when it happened that matters. The deed? Precisely. He patted his coat pocket where the folded copy now rested. A document too valuable to vanish, yet too dangerous to exist. And yet, here it is, half-signed, unsealed, and very nearly fatal. That evening, as the street lamps shimmered against the wet cobblestones, Purbright sat at his desk and made a small note. Observation: Chubb signs fraudulent transfer. Winstanley witnesses falsely. Hartley discovers poisoned before confrontation. Question: who administered poison, Chubb or an intermediary? He closed his notebook and looked toward the window. Outside, the lights of Flaxborough glowed dimly through the mist, like secrets pretending to be lamps. A faint knock interrupted his thoughts. Sergeant Love poked his head in. "Telegram for you, sir."
From London, Purbright opened it.
The message was brief. "Coming tomorrow. Have evidence of Chubb's payments. Keep safe." A.G. He folded it, thoughtful. "Well, Sergeant," he said at last, "it seems Miss Greening believes she's bringing us the cure. I only hope she realizes the disease hasn't finished spreading." The dawn that followed Miss Greening's telegram was unremarkable in most respects, except that it seemed to arrive earlier than usual, as if the town itself, aware of impending scandal,
had decided to wake before it could be accused of negligence. By 9 o'clock,
Flaxborough's gossip channels were already humming at full capacity. A stranger, a man, not local, had been found missing from his lodgings at the King's Head. His bed unslept in, his hat on the peg, his walking stick neatly by the door. By noon he was no longer missing, but discovered, seated upright on a riverside bench near the warehouses, eyes open, mouth faintly curved in that same eerie smile. The second smile in a fortnight. Inspector Purbright arrived on the scene before the usual collection of curious bystanders had swollen to its respectable size. Sergeant Love was already there, notebook in hand, trying unsuccessfully to discourage a small crowd of amateur pathologists. "Same expression, sir," Love reported. "Doctor just arrived. Says it looks like paralysis again. No bruises, no struggle. Wallet untouched. Name's William Catamole, clerk at the Midland Bank." Purbright regarded the body with quiet gravity. The financial branch of our little affair has evidently joined the narrative. He bent to examine the man's right hand. It was gloved like Hartley's had been, but the fingers were rigid, as if gripping something invisible. "Find anything near him?" "Just this, sir." Love held up a torn corner of paper, the edge of a ledger sheet, marked faintly with numbers. "Looks like bank notation." Purbright studied it briefly. "Transferred sums, initials, C.W., then A.C." He smiled faintly. "Mr. Catamole's last transaction, perhaps. I rather doubt he balanced the books before departing." The constable nearby cleared his throat nervously. "You don't think, sir, that this one's connected?" Purbright's tone was gentle. "If two men die smiling in the same week, constable, one must at least consider the possibility of a joke too cruel for coincidence." At the police station later that morning, Purbright's office resembled the calm centre of an approaching storm. Miss Greening sat opposite him, pale but composed. In front of her lay the telegram she had sent, now neatly folded beside her gloved hands. "I suppose," she said quietly, "this confirms your theory." "It complicates it," Purbright corrected. "Mr. Catamole, the bank clerk, was apparently involved in Alderman Chubb's accounts. I imagine he knew rather more about missing payments than his employer might have preferred." She met his gaze evenly. "And they killed him too." Purbright hesitated. Possibly, though I suspect that in both cases death was not the plan, merely the untidy consequence of cleverness. Miss Greening's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning, Purbright said softly, that both Hartley and Cattermole were silenced by the same method, a paralytic toxin that leaves the body calm and the face in that curious grin. Our chemist friend may have more to explain than he realizes. By mid-afternoon, the laboratory report confirmed Purbright's intuition. The cause of death was a rare compound, scopolamine hybriate, a drug used in small doses as a sedative, but, when misapplied, capable of freezing the body's muscles while leaving the mind alert until the heart gives out. Chemist could mix that easily, said Love. All he'd need's the right precursors. Indeed, said Purbright. And an alderman to tell him whom to mix it for. He stood, stretching, then picked up his hat. Come along, Sergeant. Let's see how civic conscience fares under pressure. They found Mr. Winstanley behind the counter, paler than the powders he sold. His wife was in the back room, conveniently out of earshot. Purbright's tone was light, almost conversational. A word about your prescriptions, Mr. Winstanley. You wouldn't happen to stock scopolamine hybriate, would you? The chemist's eyes widened. Why, yes, but it's restricted, of course, used only for medical compounds. Of course, said Purbright. You wouldn't dream of dispensing it without proper authority. Naturally not even if Alderman Chubb signed for it. The man's face went blank, that curious, empty stillness that falls on those who realize the truth has already arrived. I was told it was for veterinary use, he stammered. For the alderman's dog. An ambitious pet, said Purbright mildly. 2 doses in a fortnight. Winstanley's voice broke. I didn't know. He said it was legitimate. He even gave me a council requisition form.
I swear I never asked questions. No, said Purbright softly. You never did. You simply filled bottles and closed your eyes, a habit that has served many men poorly. By evening, the story of the second smile had overtaken all other entertainments in town.
The Flaxborough Chronicle ran the headline, Another Strange Death, police baffled but polite. Mrs. Good claimed she'd seen ghostly figures by the river, while the vicar's wife declared it was divine punishment for council corruption. Though when pressed, she declined to specify which councillors she meant. Purbright, reviewing his notes in the quiet of his office, drew a slow line between 3 names, Hartley, Cattermole, Chubb. Each line converged on one word, money. Love, hovering nearby, said, Sir, what do you think Alderman Chubb will do now? What all frightened men do, Sergeant. Something foolish. He looked at the clock. Nearly 9. Which reminds me, Miss Greening is due at the inn tonight. Best she doesn't stay there alone. Have a constable keep watch discreetly. Yes, sir. You think she's in danger? Purbright tamped tobacco into his pipe. In Flaxborough, Sergeant, everyone who tells the truth is in danger. He struck a match, then added thoughtfully, and yet she doesn't seem the kind who runs. At 11:30, as the town settled into its uneasy sleep, Purbright received a telephone call. The voice on the line was low, frightened, and very female. Inspector? It's Ada Greening. You better come to the river, quickly. What's happened? I saw someone watching me from the far bank. I think it was Alderman Chubb. Stay where you are, Purbright said sharply. Don't move! He was out of the office within seconds, coat collar turned up, the drizzle cold against his face. Love followed at a run. When they reached the river path, the mist was thick enough to swallow sound. Purbright's lantern beam cut through it. Reeds, water, the faint outline of the bench where Cattermole had been found. No Miss Greening. Only, floating beside the bank, a single black glove. Purbright stooped, retrieved it, and looked out into the fog where something, or someone, moved briefly, then was gone. "Sir?" Love whispered. "Was that—" Purbright's face was unreadable. "Possibly," he said quietly. "Or possibly the smile has found its next invitation." He looked toward the dark water, and for a moment even he seemed to listen, as though the river itself might be trying to confess. Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office the following morning, gazing at a cup of tea that had long since lost its nerve. Outside, the town clock struck 9 with the complacent rhythm of a place that had decided, quite reasonably, that nothing truly awful could happen within its borders. Sergeant Love entered quietly, a folded newspaper in his hand and guilt in his step. "They've printed it, sir," he said. "Front page of the Chronicle." Purbright looked up. "Third mystery on the river? Or have they gone with something more optimistic?" Love cleared his throat. "Woman vanishes, police silent. They're quoting a fisherman who claims to have seen a lady's shadow walking on the water." "Flaxborough's theology improves daily," murmured Purbright. "Soon they'll have apostles." He reached for the paper, skimmed the article, then set it down without expression. "Still no sign of Miss Greening?" "No, sir. We've searched downriver as far as the bridge. No trace, not even her handbag. The innkeeper says she left shortly before midnight, said she was meeting someone by the warehouses." Purbright's gaze drifted to the rain-misted window. "And that someone, I imagine, wasn't us." He rose, crossed to the cabinet, and took out his notebook, the running ledger of Flaxborough's moral expenditures. It opened with quiet authority on a page headed Reflections. "When men seek profit in a place of peace, the peace itself becomes currency. The town remains calm because it is convenient to do so. The first death disturbs, the second warns, the third instructs. After that, order returns, not because justice is done, but because it is embarrassing to continue talking about it." Purbright read it over, pipe unlit, lips pressed thinly together. Love shifted awkwardly. "You think she's dead, sir?" Purbright did not answer directly. "Miss Greening strikes me as a woman who plans her exits. If she is dead, it will be because someone else made the appointment." He closed the book. "Have you checked the bank again?" "Yes, sir. Catamol's ledgers show several cash withdrawals signed off by Chubb, but there's something odd. One payment, 2 days before Hartley died, listed under a different account. Initials match the chemist C.W. Purbright's eyebrow lifted. "Ah, the trail of civic decency winds on." They called on the Winstanleys once more that afternoon. The chemist looked worse than before, hands trembling, collar loose, eyes red as though he'd been reading his conscience in poor light. Mrs. Winstanley hovered near the back room, her composure fragile but defiant. "Mr. Winstanley," Purbright said calmly, "I'm afraid the pattern has grown familiar. 2 men dead, both under your prescriptions, and now a woman vanished who might have known too much. I'd appreciate an explanation that uses fewer than 5 lies." The man's lips parted, then quivered into collapse. "It wasn't meant to kill him. The alderman said it would just quiet him down, make him sign what was needed." "Indeed," said Purbright, "and instead it quieted him altogether." Mrs. Winstanley stepped forward, pale with outrage. "My husband only did what was asked of him. Alderman Chubb said it was council business, an inoculation for the civic inspectors. How could we doubt a man of standing?" "Standing," Purbright repeated. "Yes, and quite soon sitting in court." He turned to leave, but Winstanley caught his sleeve. "You must understand, Inspector, Chubb had something on everyone." He said if I refused, he'd revoke my license. He said Miss Greening was blackmailing the council. Purbright paused. Was she? I don't know, the chemist whispered. But she frightened him. He said she knew where the money went. Back at the station, Purbright stood before the wall map of Flaxborough, tracing the river's course with a forefinger. Sergeant, have we dredged near the mill yet? Started this morning, sir. Nothing so far but a bicycle and some old tyres. Purbright nodded absently. Keep at it. If Miss Greening's body isn't found, the town will decide she's gone back to London, which is far more convenient for everyone concerned. Love hesitated. Sir, you don't sound too hopeful. Purbright smiled faintly. Hope is the one commodity we're not licensed to distribute, Sergeant. He turned away from the map, looking almost weary. I sometimes think Flaxborough itself commits these crimes. We just pick the names afterward. That evening, Purbright walked home alone through the square. The gas lamps glowed faintly in the mist, and the bench beneath the clock tower stood empty, waiting for its next occupant. A boy on a bicycle passed, whistling tunelessly, and, somewhere, a dog barked. The kind of sound that might be mistaken for laughter if one were tired enough. He paused before the river path, watching the black water fold against the embankment. The surface shone like old silver, concealing whatever stories lay beneath. His thoughts moved quietly, like the current. Hartley knew too much. Catamol knew enough to confirm it. Greening knew the rest. Chubb. A faint splash interrupted his reasoning. He turned sharply. Nothing visible, only ripples catching the lamplight. For a moment he thought he saw something pale, something drifting. Then the current swallowed it. When he returned to the station, he wrote 3 words on a fresh page. One more smile. The following morning brought fresh complication. Constable Harrow entered with a bundle of telegrams and the uncertain look of a man unsure whether to salute or apologize. This one just came, sir, from London. Purbright unfolded it. The message was brief, unsigned. Don't trust her. Greening isn't what she says. She's Chubb's partner. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully. Well, he said softly, our late Mr. Hartley wasn't the only one smiling at the wrong time. Love looked puzzled. But, sir, if she's dead— And someone wants us to think she's dead, Purbright said. And that, Sergeant, is the cleverest trick of all. To vanish so completely that guilt begins arguing with itself. He slipped the telegram into his pocket, eyes distant. If Miss Greening is alive, she'll come for Chubb soon enough. If she's dead, he'll try to bury the evidence before she does. Which means? Asked Love. Purbright reached for his hat. It means, Sergeant, we must be at the council offices before the alderman decides to tidy up his paperwork, or his conscience. As they stepped into the thin October sunlight, the town looked perfectly ordinary again. Shopkeepers sweeping, buses groaning, pigeons pecking with municipal indifference. Yet beneath it all, Purbright sensed that strange, taut quiet. The pause before the curtain falls and everyone pretends not to have seen the play. Flaxborough was resuming its routine. But somewhere, in its calm, respectable heart, someone was still smiling. By Monday afternoon, Inspector Purbright had decided that it was time to stop listening and start conversing. In his own gentle, unthreatening way, of course. The citizens of Flaxborough had talked themselves into a moral fog so thick that even the guilty were beginning to feel almost innocent. The council offices, newly polished after their brief flirtation with scandal, presented a facade of civic virtue that fooled no one who had ever read a balance sheet. Alderman Chubb sat behind his desk, his usual flush replaced by a sort of clammy authority. The man looked like a pudding that had begun to suspect it was poison. Purbright entered without ceremony, followed by Sergeant Love, who carried a folder and an expression of benign patience. "Inspector," Chubb said, his voice pitched between relief and defensiveness. "Any news of that poor woman yet? Terrible business. Shocking. One hopes she's, safe." "Hope," said Purbright mildly, "is a most accommodating emotion. It tends to fit any situation, however awkward." He took the chair opposite. Chubb placed his hat neatly on the desk and opened the folder with deliberate leisure. "We've been tracing certain financial movements, Alderman. You'll be gratified to hear your name appears frequently." Chubb blinked. "Oh? Administrative oversight, no doubt?" "Undoubtedly," said Purbright, smiling thinly. "The oversight, however, involved sums paid into a private account, one held in partnership with a Miss Ada Greening." The alderman's jaw sagged. "That woman! She was merely an advisor, some sort of financial consultant. I only met her twice." Purbright looked pleasantly unconvinced. "Curious, then, that you share an account." "Temporary arrangement, a technicality." "Of course," said Purbright.
And Mr. Hartley's death also a technicality, as was that of Mr. Catamol, who handled your bank transfers. Chubb's colour deepened alarmingly. "Now see here, Inspector, I've been a public servant for 20 years. I'll not have my reputation sullied by accuracy," Purbright interrupted gently.
"No, I shouldn't think you would." He leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "Mr. Hartley discovered your arrangement with Miss Greening. He intended to present the fraudulent deeds to the ministry. You or one of your allies arranged for him to be given a dose of something calming."
Only it calmed him rather too completely. Chubb's hands fumbled at his tie. "That's preposterous." "Indeed," said Purbright softly, "which is why it must be true. The truth always is." The door opened quietly, and Constable Harrow entered with a single object, sealed in a plastic envelope.
"Found this in the river dredge, sir," he said. "Thought you'd want it." Purbright took it, turned it slowly. A silver locket, engraved with the initials A.G. Chubb's eyes flickered to it involuntarily. "Recognize it?" asked Purbright. Chubb swallowed. "No, should I?" "Miss Greening wore it the day she arrived," said Purbright, voice still gentle. "Interesting that it should turn up near the warehouses, the very spot you were seen visiting that same evening. I was inspecting council property. With a lantern at midnight." Purbright's tone was conversational, but the silence following it was heavy enough to fill the room. Finally, Chubb exhaled. "I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. She came to me that night, demanded money, said she had proof of the transfers. I told her I'd pay just to calm her down. But she laughed. Said she'd already sent copies to the police. And then she left," Chubb said weakly. "I watched her go down toward the river. I never saw her again." "Perhaps not," said Purbright. "But someone else did. And that someone wanted her silence even more than you did." After leaving Chubb's office, Purbright and Love walked in silence until they reached the square. The inspector's thoughts seemed to travel several feet ahead of him. "Sir," Love ventured, "do you believe him?" "Almost entirely," Purbright said. "Which is how one knows he's lying," Love frowned. "You mean—" "I mean that only a truthful man lies so convincingly. Chubb may not have killed her himself, but he knows precisely who did." He paused, gazing up at the clock tower. "It's the smallest details that betray guilt, Sergeant. Tone, phrasing, hesitation. People's voices forget to lie when their words remember to." That evening, Purbright invited 3 guests to the station. Alderman Chubb, Mr. Winstanley the chemist, and Mrs. Winstanley. The invitation was phrased politely enough to suggest choice, though in reality there was none. They were ushered into the conference room, where tea and biscuits waited like peace offerings. Purbright entered last, carrying no notes, no file, only a calm expression that made people nervous. He took his seat and looked at each of them in turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for coming. I imagine you all know one another quite well by now. Shared interests, shared secrets, and soon, perhaps, shared consequences." Chubb shifted. "Really, Inspector, please," Purbright said pleasantly. "No need to rehearse the outrage. We're all friends here, or at least fellow accomplices in the same misunderstanding." A delicate silence settled over the table. "Mr. Winstanley," Purbright continued, "you supplied a chemical compound to Alderman Chubb under false pretense. You believed it to be harmless, perhaps mildly sedative, but it was not. It killed a man. The same compound later killed another. Both doses we now know came from your shop." The chemist's lower lip trembled. "I didn't know—" "I quite believe you didn't," said Purbright. "But your ignorance was assisted, carefully cultivated, in fact, by the person who told you how much to mix." Mrs. Winstanley stiffened. "Surely you don't mean—" "Oh, but I do," Purbright said softly. "It was you, madam, who filled those prescriptions, not your husband. You said so yourself once. I notice everything. And you did." "Especially the alderman's handwriting." The woman's mouth opened, then shut again like a trap catching air. Purbright continued, voice still mild. "When Miss Greening arrived and began asking questions, you realized your part in the deception might come to light. You met her by the river that night, intending to frighten her. Perhaps you even meant to hand over the locket she dropped in the struggle." Mrs. Winstanley's face had gone chalk white. "She attacked me. I only pushed her away. She slipped." "Into the river," Purbright finished gently. "And you watched her vanish. Then you went home and told your husband you'd been up late cleaning bottles." A long silence followed, the kind of silence that arrives only when denial has nowhere left to sit. Chubb slumped in his chair. The chemist stared at the table, and Mrs. Winstanley wept into a handkerchief as though propriety demanded she remain tidy even in guilt. Purbright rose, his tone almost kind. "You see, in Flaxborough, crimes are never committed with malice, only with inconvenience. People wish to remain comfortable even while destroying one another. The smiles come afterward, to reassure themselves they're still decent." He nodded to Love. "Take them, Sergeant. All three. It will give the town something wholesome to gossip about." As they were led away, Chubb turned back, face grey with disbelief. "You'll ruin everything, Purbright. Do you know what this will do to our reputation?" Purbright regarded him calmly. "I imagine it will make it rather more accurate." 2 days later, the town of Flaxborough awoke to a calm that felt not quite earned. The Chronicle announced the arrests in sober italics. Council scandal unfolds. Police praise community cooperation. No one could remember exactly who had cooperated, but the phrase comforted the public conscience. The Winstanleys had confessed enough to satisfy the Crown, and Alderman Chubb, true to form, had begun to assist inquiries with a vigour that suggested he might sell information by the ounce if it lightened his own guilt. Through it all, Inspector Purbright moved with his usual quiet civility, tidying the loose ends of human behaviour as though they were paperclips on an untidy desk. The formal statement took place in the council chamber, the setting chosen, at the mayor's insistence, to remind the public that transparency remains the cornerstone of local government. The irony was so dense one could have paved the high street with it. The press were allowed in, The reporters sharpened pencils with solemn delight. At the long mahogany table sat Purbright, Sergeant Love, the surviving suspects, and a handful of counsellors who looked as though they'd wandered into the wrong funeral. Purbright cleared his throat, the sound polite but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, what follows is not an accusation but an arrangement of facts. They are unpleasant, though fortunately quite ordinary." He paused long enough to let that sink in. Mr. Colin Hartley arrived in Flaxborough 3 weeks ago to finalise the purchase of warehouse property on behalf of Miss Ada Greening. In doing so, he discovered irregularities in the council's sale procedures, namely, that Alderman Chubb had been reselling public property through front companies for private gain. One of those companies bore Miss Greening's initials. Chubb made a wounded noise.
"I told you she deceived me." "Yes," said Purbright, "you did tell me."
But unfortunately, she told the ministry first. A faint ripple of amusement passed through the reporters. Purbright continued. Mr. Hartley intended to expose this arrangement. Mr. Winstanley, at the alderman's request, prepared a sedative mixture, ostensibly harmless. However, Mrs. Winstanley, who enjoyed both curiosity and access to the shelves, altered the dosage to something rather stronger. Mr. Hartley was given the drug the night he went to collect the signed deed. It froze his muscles, including the face, hence the peculiar smile. Death by paralysis of the heart. He let the whisper of pens scratching fill the pause. When the news of his death spread, panic followed. Miss Greening, who feared she might be implicated or silenced, returned to Flaxborough with documents proving Chubb's transactions. Mr. Cattermole, the bank clerk who handled those transfers, grew nervous and threatened to resign. He was invited to a private meeting by Mrs. Winstanley, again acting under the alderman's persuasion.
Another dose of calm. Another smile. Sergeant Love, watching the councillors' faces,
Later said he could almost hear their faith in municipal honesty expire. Purbright's tone remained level, almost kind. Miss Greening, realizing the danger, confronted Chubb by the river that night. She demanded payment for her silence or exposure for his crime. We may never know which. What we do know is that Mrs. Winstanley, who feared Miss Greening would mention the chemist's involvement, followed her. There was an argument, a shove, and an accident. The only part of this sordid tale that may truly claim that word. He looked toward Mrs. Winstanley, whose face was wet but expressionless. "Your confession was unnecessary, madam. Your eyes made it for you the moment you entered the room." Afterward, the reporters surged forward with the enthusiasm of those who smell morality safely packaged. Purbright deflected them gently.
"Offered nothing more than Flaxborough remains as ever."
A community devoted to quiet reflection. When they were gone, he turned to Love, who had been taking notes, less for the record than for comprehension. "You see, Sergeant," he said, the smiles were not coincidence. Each was the same expression, i.e., the body's last small rebellion against deceit. "A man may die of poison, but he dies smiling only when his conscience had begun to relax." Love frowned. "I'd say that's a grim sort of comfort, sir." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "but comfort rarely comes from the truth. It's why Flaxborough prefers the newspaper." That evening the inspector walked once more through the square. The gas lamp had been polished, the bench replaced. The town, with admirable efficiency, had erased all physical trace of its moral disturbance. Mrs. Good at the bakery had already found new material. The vicar's niece, apparently, was seen smoking near the post office. Balance restored. Purbright paused beneath the clock tower, the same one that had observed the first smile, and looked up at its solemn, inaccurate face. He lit his pipe, letting the smoke drift across the cobblestones. Behind him, Love appeared, looking unusually thoughtful. "Never quite adds up, does it, sir?" "What doesn't?" "Why people like them do it. All that lying, for a bit of money or pride." "They had everything they wanted already." Purbright smiled faintly. "Not quite. They lacked imagination, and so they mistook comfort for virtue. Most of our sinners here aren't villains, Sergeant. They're just impatient to be respectable, he exhaled, the smoke curling toward the dark river beyond the square. Still, he added, I'll miss the smiles. They were instructive. The next morning, the council issued a press statement thanking the police for their swift and sensitive resolution. A replacement alderman was elected within a week. A quieter man, less ambitious, more inclined toward civic tea parties than redevelopment schemes. The chemist shop changed hands. Mrs. Winstanley's sister ran it thereafter, assuring customers that our medicines contain nothing but honesty. The river went back to being a river, the gossip to being gospel, and Flaxborough resumed its ancient rhythm. Tranquil, courteous, incurably human in his office, Purbright wrote his final line in the case file before closing it neatly. People smile for many reasons, some because they are kind, others because they have finally stopped pretending to be. He signed his name below it, capped his pen, and reached for the next stack of reports. Minor complaints of noise, misplaced bicycles, and one alarming incident involving a vicar's goose. Just another day in Flaxborough. In the weeks that followed, Flaxborough did what Flaxborough always did after a scandal. It forgot selectively, forgave conditionally, and congratulated itself thoroughly. By the first Monday of November, the market square had returned to its usual rhythm. The baker calling out cheerful lies about freshness, the postmistress distributing gossip more efficiently than letters, and the council's flag fluttering dutifully in an apologetic breeze. The town's wounds, such as they were, had been disinfected by time, silence, and Mrs. Good's meat pies. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk beneath a modest pile of new paperwork. Lost dogs, misplaced handbags, one broken lamppost, all the ordinary injuries of civic life. He worked through them with a calm that bordered on affection. Sergeant Love entered carrying 2 cups of tea and a sheaf of forms. "Morning, sir." The Chronicle's got a new headline. Peace returns to Flaxborough. Police praised for discretion. Purbright accepted the tea with a faint smile. Discretion, Sergeant, is merely honesty with good manners. It's always newsworthy when we remember to use it. Love grinned. Public seems pleased, sir. People say it's good to see things back to normal. Normal, Purbright repeated softly.
An admirable illusion?
Like good weather or civic virtue. Fragile but comforting. He leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. What remains of our dramatist persona? Well, sir, said Love, consulting his notes. Chubb's resigned, of course. The Winstanleys are bound over pending trial. Miss Greening? Well, her body's not been found, but the ministry's confirmed her documents were genuine. Council's property records are under audit.
And Mrs. Good's putting on a charity bake to restore community faith. Faith, said Purbright dryly.
Has always proved remarkably digestible when baked in pastry. At midday, the inspector took his habitual walk through the town. The air was crisp, the cobblestones clean, the shopkeepers politely uncurious. Flaxborough, in its peculiar way, had already rearranged the moral furniture to make space for comfort. Outside the King's Head, 2 men discussed the affair in the tone reserved for weather and cricket. Terrible thing, all that poisoning, said one.
But you can't fault the council for handling it proper, eh?
Proper, agreed the other. Never let it spoil the flower show, Purbright passed without comment, his expression one of faint amusement. He paused at the river, where the water, now low and sluggish, revealed reeds and stones that had been hidden during the drama. The bench where Hartley's smiling body had been found was empty, its replacement made of newer wood, the kind that has not yet learned the weight of secrets. He watched the current for a moment, its surface reflecting the sky like a conscience pretending innocence. Then he turned toward the station, where duty and tea waited faithfully. That evening, As he signed the day's final report, Purbright reflected that the town's peace was not the reward of justice, but its substitute. He had learned that Flaxborough preferred its tragedies brief and its morals optional. The telephone rang. Sergeant Love's voice came through, steady and a little hesitant.
Sir, just got word from the River Patrol. They've recovered something near the weir.
Not a body this time, though.
A handbag. Leather. Initials A.G. Purbright paused, then said quietly, "Tell them to keep it safe."
We may yet discover that some ghosts prefer punctuality. Yes, sir.
You think she's...
I think, said Purbright, that Miss Greening's smile will linger a while longer in the town's imagination, and perhaps that's punishment enough. He replaced the receiver, opened the window, and looked out toward the darkened square. The lamps burned steady, their light yellow and patient, illuminating nothing that wished to remain hidden. The night air smelled faintly of chimney smoke and peace. Manufactured, perhaps, but pleasant all the same. Below, a cat padded across the cobbles with the self-importance of a creature entirely unconcerned with human guilt. Somewhere, a church clock began to strike, unhurried, indifferent, eternal. Purbright listened to its rhythm and thought how all towns, in the end, desired only the appearance of order, not the substance of it. Order was tidy, comprehensible, and photographable, unlike truth, which tended to stain. He turned back to his desk and began to write in his logbook. Case closed. Public tranquility restored. Private disquiet ongoing. Recommend vigilance, tempered with tea. He blotted the page carefully and closed the ledger with a quiet snap. Outside, Flaxborough exhaled. The square slept, the gaslights flickered, and somewhere, perhaps in memory, perhaps in guilt, a faint echo of laughter seemed to rise from the riverbank. It might have been wind, or water, or the ghost of a woman who had smiled once at midnight and left the town forever changed. Though it would never admit it, Purbright extinguished his lamp, adjusted his hat, and murmured to the empty room, peace, like respectability, must be renewed daily. He locked the door behind him and stepped into the quiet street, where even the shadows seemed polite.